In the previous video, I discussed one way of thinking about the variation that can occur within feminism. Such can be understood in terms of how much one wants to change society. Some feminists implement modest critiques to how society operates and want to bring about mild reforms. Others, however, level far more fundamental criticisms at how society is structured and want to bring about deep-seated changes that question core components of the current system. In this video, I'd like to build off what has already been discussed by talking about three different components of feminism: the scientific, the moral, and the movement. After examining each in isolation, I'll show how each can give rise to disagreements, followed by a brief statement on how these approaches are related to what I discussed in the former video. Finally, I'll conclude by showing how the content of this video can help us discuss, understand, and assess issues related to feminism in a way that is more productive than much of what I've encountered on the internet. When it comes to the scientific component, it's worth clarifying what science actually is. Although this is a somewhat complicated question, and perhaps a bit more difficult to answer than many realize, for the purpose of this video, I'll define science as a discipline that seeks to describe and explain the universe. It does this by making observations, testing ideas about the world, and developing explanations which integrate as much information as possible in a coherent manner. Such can assess a number of different realms. For example, we can investigate how atoms and molecules interact with one another. We can look at how cells function. We can study how organisms behave within society, and examine the workings of solar systems and galaxies. Within feminism, most of the emphasis is on how society operates, how women are treated, and what their experience is like. Examples of scientific claims include statements like, women tend to earn less money than men do, women are underrepresented in fields like engineering and politics, 1 in 4 women will be sexually assaulted during their time at college, and roughly 1 in 3 women in the US have experienced domestic violence. Although these numbers, or their interpretation, may not be fully agreed upon, the main point to grasp is that these claims are descriptive in nature. When it comes to the moral component, it is again worth noting that this is a complicated topic, and there are different perspectives on the precise nature of morality. Nevertheless, for the purpose of this video, I'll define it as dealing with how society ought to be and how we ought to act. This aspect of feminism can be thought of as generating more fundamental claims and more specific claims. Examples of fundamental claims include things like women ought to have equal rights with men, women ought to have the freedom and liberty to engage in bodily autonomy and self-determination, and women ought to have freedom and liberty from discrimination, oppression, and subordination. More specific claims may be statements like men ought not to rape women ought to receive equal pay for equal work, and, perhaps more controversially, women ought to have safe and affordable access to abortion. It's important to note that these statements say nothing about how society actually is. They simply prescribe how society ought to be. Finally, we have the movement component. This emerges when a gap between the scientific and moral components exists. It tries to make the way society is align with our ideals of how it ought to be. Such may occur through a number of different means such as protests, marches, making laws, educating the public, staging boycotts, and electing officials into public office. Each of these components can play an important role in shaping what most people think of as feminism. And given how controversial the term is, it should be of no surprise that all of these aspects can give rise to disagreements of their own. One way of illustrating this is by examining the topic of sexual assault. For this video, I'll define sexual assault as any unwanted sexual contact, ranging from unwanted touching to rape. The scientific debate tends to occur over the prevalence of this crime. Feminists typically will cite statistics which suggest that it is a common occurrence in society, whereas critics will question the way in which these numbers were produced and suggest that feminists are over-exaggerating the extent to which sexual assault occurs. When it comes to the moral domain, there is typically a consensus that sexual assault is wrong. However, there may be some disagreements over what counts as sexual assault. Some have suggested that certain gray areas exist, especially when alcohol is involved. They may claim that, although there are clear instances where one person is very drunk and gets taken advantage of, it isn't entirely clear how much one must drink before one is unable to consent. They may ask, at what point does the person become a victim and the other party become a perpetrator by default? At what point do we hold the sober person morally accountable or claim that they are morally to blame for what happened? And what do we make of situations where both individuals are drunk? Are both people perpetrators and victims at the same time? Or do we put blame on one person, and if so, how do we determine what person is in the moral wrong? For some, these and other questions may give rise to disagreements over the precise scope and contours of what constitutes sexual assault. The movement component has its own set of unique controversies. One example that has received a lot of attention deals with how sexual assault allegations are handled on college campuses. Without getting into too much of the details, some have pushed for colleges to take accountability for what is seen as a sexual assault epidemic on campus. As a result, many have started handling cases where students claim to have been sexually assaulted. While some have seen this as a step in the right direction towards holding criminals accountable and reducing the prevalence of this crime, others have pointed out that the way in which this has happened is deeply flawed. Much of this criticism claims that these procedures violate due process. Far too often, those who are accused of committing sexual assault aren't granted access to resources to adequately defend themselves. Such, some claim, has created a situation where the procedure is deeply biased. At this point, hopefully I've been able to clarify the three aspects of feminism and how each can give rise to disagreements. Now I'd like to show how this way of thinking about feminism can work together with the approach that I had outlined in the previous video. In other words, we can think about the variation that occurs within feminism through the lens of these three components. This should be intuitively plausible. After all, how much feminists want to change society depends on their views about feminism's moral and scientific components. For those who see the difference between the scientific component of how things are and the moral aspect of how things ought to be as relatively small, then modest changes to society are sufficient to accomplish one's goals. On the other hand, for those who see the difference between the scientific and moral domains as large, far more systemic and fundamental changes are warranted. Such differences will then impact what the movement component aims to accomplish, thereby impacting how it materializes in society. With these three aspects of feminism covered, I'd now like to offer some closing thoughts on why this approach is beneficial. First, it can enhance the discussions we have by enabling us to talk about feminism in a more precise manner. One point of this video, as well as the one before it, is to show that feminism is a complex entity. Not only are there differences between feminists, but the specific views of any given feminist has a number of different components within it. I have discussed three which I think are the most important, but more could be added. Moreover, there are also a number of different claims made within each component. A well-developed feminist perspective will consist of a number of different scientific statements, moral propositions, and movement tactics. By having an explicit awareness of these variables that are contained within feminism, hopefully we can appreciate the need to discuss specific issues that surround the term, rather than simply critique or support it in a loose and general manner. Second, by altering the way we discuss feminism, we can enhance our capacity to understand it. Discussions that incorporate the nuances of the topic we are addressing can give us a greater appreciation for and a deeper knowledge about what others believe. This can help us avoid making assumptions about what others think simply based on the label they apply to themselves. As I noted in the previous video, the term feminism may not always be as informative as we think. Acknowledging this can compel us to probe deeper when others use the term. Doing so will allow us to develop an understanding of where we agree or disagree with what feminists say. It can also cause those who identify as feminists to reflect more on what their beliefs consist of. Finally, more productive discussions about and a deeper understanding of feminism can equip us with the tools needed to adequately assess it. Unfortunately, it can be all too easy for people to critique what they think feminists believe rather than what feminists actually believe. This creates a scenario where strong disagreements are maintained, as those with differing perspectives talk past one another. In other instances, People may generalize about feminism based on bad encounters with or inappropriate actions done by just a few individuals. Given the complexity of feminism, this assessment is prone to breed false stereotypes. Any worthwhile evaluation must be built upon a thorough understanding of the view one is analyzing. Because of this, approaching feminism in a way that appreciates its nuance and complexity is foundational for truthfully evaluating its claims. Hopefully you found this video to be helpful in some way. It's of course important to emphasize that I was only able to give a brief overview of the topics discussed. At a minimum, I hope to have offered a useful, thought-provoking way of reflecting upon and learning about feminism that most people can employ. With that said, thanks for watching, and goodbye.